Hello, everybody. The neocons are now dreaming of a so-called third war that we really need to talk about. And you know how they always cushion these horrible things like killing, mass slaughtering people, how they always find cute words to describe those. This article here in Foreign Policy is doing exactly that by talking now about death and destruction bringing weaponry about as the arsenal of democracy, right? So this article tells us something about what the neocons want to do when it comes to ramping up the production capacity of the US and Europe in order to fight more war. The interesting thing is also that the article really very openly admits that it's not just one war or two, but how do you fight 3 wars at once? And, you know, the schizophrenia of the neocons is always that they have to pretend that 2 things are true at the same time. So they still pretend that the war in Ukraine and also the Israel's genocide against Gaza has nothing to do with the United States. Nothing. It's not the West's problem. These are separate wars, but then they talk about how it is very important to keep these wars going. The article really clearly starts with the United States has to build weaponry to fend off a potential war with China. And when they say fending off, they always mean fighting with. While helping countries such as Ukraine and Israel fend for themselves in wars of their own. The schizophrenia is huge, but what it tells us is that now the neocons in DC and also in Brussels, they're all looking for ways to grapple with the problem that we know for 1 or 1.5 years, that the West just doesn't produce enough, is running out of weaponry, right? The Ukraine is in a stalemate, and a large part of that has to do because the West just cannot outproduce China. And we can see this fear very clearly when we switch to this other neocon outlet, the Foreign Affairs. Where is it? This one here. Like just the title page, just study it for a second. Like 2 or 3 out of the title page articles are about this problem here. For instance, how Beijing is exploiting Israel's war to win over the global south. The neocons are very worried about the way that these wars look toward the rest of the world that is not captured in this propagandized bubble. And here, this one, the Ukraine-Taiwan trade-off. US support for Ukraine diverts weapons from Taiwan, but demonstrates resolve to China. They're in somewhat of a conundrum here. And this article in Foreign Policy brings this out, how it tries to shill and tries to make us feel an urge to produce more weapons. More weapons is what you need. And the interesting thing is this is written by this Jack Detch guy, and he's a staff writer for Foreign Policy. So he did some research, and he called up very important people, including defense ministers in Europe, to get a hunch on what the situation of the provisions, the military provisions look like. So while trying to cheer up with his pretty little smile, right, cheering for war. While cheering for war, he also then talks about all the problems that they're having right now. And, you know, whenever the neocons talk about problems, they usually mean something where we need to invest more money in order to kill more people, right? So the article he cites this Rob Bauer, the chairman of NATO's military committee, actually, who says that we are moving from a just-in-time, just-enough economy model to peak demand model when it comes to producing more military equipment. And this is this entire transatlantic network here that works together, the United States and Europe, to produce, that's now trying to figure out how to produce more weapons. Even though business is booming, Defense Department officials are facing a problem from hell. From hell, my friends. How can the Pentagon mobilize the US defense industry to respond to not just 1 conflict or 2, but to potentially 3 wars? They really are now preparing to have all of these conflicts run at the same time. And this gives me a sense of the neocons really trying to get us into a world war, one one conflict at a time and letting them all run parallelly to each other. I think that's the idea. Although I must say there is historical precedent for this, and that's not that wouldn't bode well for the United States, but I'll give you that one later. What makes planning especially difficult to the neocons is what they call frictions of war. Nobody expected the war in Ukraine to suck up thousands of artillery shells every single day, year after year. Yeah, what makes this difficult is that war is so unpredictable, and that it took so long, and that Russia didn't just give up, and that all the economic sanctions didn't work. Who could have foreseen that? Seriously. Then President Franklin D. Roosevelt called the U.S. weaponry the arsenal of democracy. In 5 years, U.S. factories built 141 aircraft carriers, 88,412 self-propelled guns and tanks, and 257,000 artillery guns. And you can tell that the staff writer really appreciates that, and he admires it, that the industrial capacity of the U.S. was so huge of creating all of this killing potential. Now Washington is trying to get back in business after 3 decades of post-Cold War belt-tightening that saw companies merge and production lines slow down. I mean, all the belt-tightening the United States did with all of its military bases, 750 military bases around the world, and all of these trillions of dollars that are being used on the US military industrial complex, and all of these equipments that have the aircraft carriers, the huge the huge Air Force, and the second largest military in the world, having the most airplanes after the Air Force, is the US Navy, right? All of this equipment is called belt tightening. The United States has been belt tightening over the last 30 years, the largest military power in the world. But that's the framework of the mindset of these people. It's never enough. It needs to be more, and they want to be able to use it. So that's the point. If you produce more military equipment, you need more war in order to use it, right? Otherwise, you know, you have too much stockpile, and then you cannot sell. So the neocons are telling us that they are working on creating not only the capacity, but then also the outlets for this death and destruction. And that these weapons still have to be funded, right? We must never forget that the US taxpayer, and actually European taxpayers too, that they have to fund more weapons that can be used in order to kill people, presumably outside of the US and Europe, but even inside. As long as they are poor, it doesn't really matter, right? Just as we know, the only time when these people have serious issues is when these weapons are then used by the wrong people, like when they are being sold on the black market, and then they themselves are being targeted, which is certainly what's going to happen with all of these weapons that went to Ukraine and ended up in a black market. When it comes to putting shells in barrels, the magic number of 100,000 rounds per month by the end of 2025 is what these US neocons are striving for, to create more and more shells, because we've learned now through the Ukraine war that in a conventional war setting, shells are actually still some of the most important gear. The European Union is producing between 600,000 and 700,000 artillery shells per year. And it's also interesting that this article talks quite a lot also about Europe's capacity, as if though Europe's capacity was integrated and was part and parcel of what the United States can provide, which also shows, again, how these people think about these production capacities and the war-making potential. It's all about the combined West, the collective West, and NATO is definitely not a tool anymore to defend Europe. It is a tool now to use Europe's capacities and then use them for the purposes of the neocons. So when they think about a third war, presumably with China, but maybe with Iran in West Asia, we know that these people always think of the combined NATO forces, and that NATO definitely by now is a tool to exploit the Europeans. And the Europeans are too dumb honestly, to understand it. As Jeffrey Sachs says, they are not. They're just not waking up from this slumber. The European, and here, this is this guy, this staff writer even managed to interview the Estonian defense minister on this issue. So they are working, all of these NATO countries working hand in hand to gear up toward even the next war that's coming up. But Ukraine's appetite for artillery ammo is ferocious. This is something that surprises them, and they are firing them against the Russians, of course. There is no option but to rise to the occasion in this regard, Swedish defense minister Paul Johnson said in an interview with Foreign Policy. So again, more European leaders saying that the production capacity has to rise. And when it comes to so-called smart bombs, weapons with GPS guidance kits built in, the situation is even more dire. Again, there's this flip-flop between everything is going fine, we just need to do more, to like, oh, we are facing such a huge problem, and everybody now needs to get together and needs to pledge more money to solve the problem. All of that is without accounting for weapons needed to fight the next war. Again, the next war is on the horizon. China has done everything short of invading Taiwan, though it has vowed to do so at some point soon. And again, these people are already blaming China for something it hasn't done yet, and has said it doesn't want to do, and has said it wants to have a political solution. But these people are already saying, but the sheer fact that China is developing military capacities is already proof that it is doing everything except for invading Taiwan. These people are just absolutely crazy, and they are hungry for war. Further down the food chain, the US Defense Department is running into problems. The supply chain apparently isn't working the way that they would like it to have. Europe is feeling the same crunch. So what they're worried about is really to run out of shells and run out of ammunition. But at the same time, they're still actually preparing for the next war. And the thing is, the wars that are still running, they're still pretending that everything is fine. The second article here on Foreign Affairs is again a masterpiece of a neocon, Jack Watling, this dude over here, senior research fellow for land warfare at one of the think tanks, is like, again, saying that, you know, Ukraine is not lost. We just need to fight. We just need to provide more weapons and everything will be fine. In the end, we need a long-term strategy. The meat grinder needs to grind on. The narrative that he's trying to sell is that since the failure of offensives, the failure of offensives in 2023 by both Ukraine and Russia, he's trying to sell the idea that it's not Ukraine's offensive that failed alone. It's also Russia's offensive. There were two offensives and both of them failed. So, you know, it's not as bad. It's not that Ukraine said we're going to attack it, we're going to win back our land, and the Russians managed to fence that off. No. The Russians were also trying to offend, but both of them kind of didn't go where they were supposed to do. And he then complains that this narrative is coalescing, that the war in Ukraine has reached a stalemate. And he says, no, it's not a stalemate. This is wrong. This is wrong thinking. It's just a little bit of a prolonging of the war, and now we need a long-term strategy. This perception is deeply flawed. Both Moscow and Kiev are in a race to rebuild offensive combat power. And you see how it goes together with what also the Foreign Policy writes about, that the ability to fight these wars, that's what we really need to care about. And of course, this article goes into the usual dogma and mantra of the neocons. The West, in fact, faces a crucial choice right now: support Ukraine so that its leaders can defend their territory and prepare for a 2025 offensive, or cede an irrecoverable advantage to Russia. And that uncertainty about the long-term provisions of aid, of military aid, of course, what he means of weapons, has already undermined the goal to push Russia to the negotiating table. These people are crazy. I mean, as if pushing Russia to the negotiating table had ever been part of their agenda, they would have picked them up on their December 2021 offer that they sent to Washington and to Brussels to actually negotiate a European security structure, which which NATO just laughed out of the room and said, Russia, sit down, shut up, and you should know your place. And they would have picked the Russians up on their offer in March 2022 to actually negotiate an end to this goddamn conflict in Istanbul, which we know Boris Johnson and NATO, the collective West, torpedoed in favor of continue fighting this war. So the people who try to spin and twist around the narrative still play with this idea that they are the ones who are interested in diplomacy and that the Russians and the Chinese are the evil ones who only want to solve all problems with weapons. It's a fantastic, phenomenal spin on actual reality in which it is the West and NATO that is pushing as hard as possible on getting war and getting more war, and it makes me extremely angry. But okay, this is their mindset. Although I never know if these people are lying or if they're just too dumb, or if they actually believe this their own propaganda. I don't know. But we can clearly see that the people are worried about having not enough weapons. Ukraine's international partners must remember that the first outcome is desirable not only to Ukrainians, like Ukraine winning the war, right? It is necessary to protect the international norm that states do not change their borders by force, except you're called Israel, in which case you can change any border, all borders, you can do a genocide, and you can do whatever you want. You can annex the Golan Heights, you can annex the West Bank, you can annex Gaza, you can throw out people out of their homes. It doesn't matter. If you're called Israel, then there's a different set of rules for you. But when you are somebody that the West is not friendly with, then we have very clear, strict rules that change every other minute, but that we will pretend that have been there for the last 2,000 years. Unless you're one of our allies, right? In which case we can do whatever we want. I hate these people. In the Ukraine in 2023 offensive, then the article talks about why the offensive went wrong and blah, 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 blah. Reforms in Ukrainian troop training are necessary for more effective offensive operations. So, and the article is at least in this sense interesting as it says that, it was the lack of training that led to the failure of the offensive, and that now we need to invest into more weaponry and into more military training. But the direction is absolutely clear: more military resources for more war. Now, I'm not going to go through all the rest of this. What we learn from all of this, really, also from the current publications, is that the collective West is contemplating more war. And although all of these publications talk about China and Taiwan as the next potential theater, by the way that the things are developing right now in West Asia around Israel, we know it could just as well be a third war, and with Iran, and it could be a huge Middle Eastern, West Asian conflagration and spreading of the war. And a war with Iran would at least be as catastrophic as a war between the United States and China. And these people are preparing for that, and they're kind of looking forward to it. They are thinking about it in terms of like making even more money and selling even more weapons and equipment and training even more foreign populations to fight the proxy wars of the US. And European states are collaborating with this, and they're completely captured in the narrative of the US and the transatlanticist. And unless this stops, these people have no reverse gear, as the good people from the Duran usually say. We have an example in history for what happens when countries are bogged down in several wars that actually bind their capacities and they start new wars. That's exactly what happened to the Japanese Empire during the long Second World War. They got bogged down in a horrible war in China that they couldn't resolve. Then they had a stalemate with the Russians between Manchuria/Mongolia at the time. And then to resolve all of that, they decided to, F it all, let's go and fight a war with the United States and go south into Southeast Asia, just try to reach that oil that we need so desperately somewhere in Indonesia. And they completely, utterly overstretched all of the capacity that they had. They knew that there was about 2 years worth of oil reserves and supplies, and that after that they would run out. But they still chose the warmongers in the two military branches of the Japanese Imperial Army. They chose that this would be the route to go. You have to demonstrate strength. You cannot look weak. This is the same mindset that's right now reigning in Washington, that even though you obviously have shortcomings and it would be much better to actually negotiate with the people that you dislike, they push for more war. And what's even worse is that they keep claiming that the other one is responsible for that. It's China's fault, it's Russia's fault that the poor United States and poor NATO, those downbeaten angels of goodness, are now forced to invest more into their defense industries. Unless this stops, unless this changes, we are spiraling toward a third, not only war, but potentially a third world war. The ideology in the West is crazy. See you in the next one.